Good evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I serve as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia, what we call AAADS. I'm speaking this evening on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape. I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. For the past 28 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by the late Dr. Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility in Black studies. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our new department of AAADS, IRAAS continues to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience, with ongoing series like tonight's conversation. So I want to welcome you all to tonight's conversations, Visualizing Black Lives, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media, by Dr. Reighan Gillam, in dialogue with Dr. Racquel Gates. This event is co-sponsored with the Center for Ethnicity and Race and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society here at Columbia University. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Reighan Gillam, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Southern California. In journal articles, public discussions, podcasts, and monographs, her research examines media at the intersection of racial ideologies, anti-racism, and protests. Dr. Gillam served as the Peggy Rockefeller Fellow at Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation. She was elected to the Executive Committee of the Brazilian Studies Association. Dr. Gillam is currently a host of the New Books Network podcasts, where she interviews authors about their recently published academic books. She's currently on work on a project provisionally titled Diasporic Agency, Transnational Racial Leverage, and the Challenges to Exceptionalism, that examines how Afro-Brazilians draw upon African American people, performances, and ideas to question ideas of Brazilian racial exceptionalism. But this evening is to celebrate and discuss her forthcoming book, Visualizing Black Lives, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media, that focuses on the way that Afro-Brazilian media producers create images that render Black subjects and their experiences in complex ways. As she shares in the book, quote, "Minoritized and subaltern communities and individuals constitute media as a site of struggle as they turn to the practice of creating their own media as an act of self-determination, cultural preservation, or, in the case of many indigenous people, sovereignty," end quote. So we'll find out more about the role of media in anti-racist struggles in Brazil, a nation that often represents itself as a multiracial, miscegenated, liberal democracy. Joining Dr. Gillam this evening is our colleague, Dr. Racquel Gates, who is an associate professor of film and media and a AAADS research fellow here at Columbia University. Her research focuses on Blackness and popular culture, with special attention to discourses of taste and quality, and her work appears both in academic and also mainstream publications. And you may have read her in the New York Times, The Root, the Los Angeles Review of Books, or Film Quarterly. Dr. Gates is also the author of Double Negative, The Black Image and Popular Culture, published by Duke in 2018, where she argues that some of the most disreputable representations of Black people in popular culture can strategically pose questions about Blackness, Black culture, and American society in ways that more respectable ones cannot. Dr. Gates is currently working on a second book, Hollywood Style and the Inventions of Blackness. And in 2020, she was named an Academy Film Scholar by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So you could see why Dr. Gillam and Dr. Gates will be in conversation. So we begin with a short presentation by Reighan, followed by a conversation with Racquel. And just to remind you, we will open the Q&A toward the end of this event. So please write your question in the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your Zoom window. So not in the chat, but in the Q&A feature. And we'll remind you in the chat to leave it in the Q&A feature. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Reighan Gillam.
You see my screen and hear me okay? Okay, great. So good evening, everyone, and or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where people are located. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Mabel Wilson and the Institute for Research in African American Studies and the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University. I'd also like to thank Dr. Racquel Gates for graciously offering to be in conversation with me at this event. Being here is an honor, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. This is one of my first events for the book, and I would like to thank my parents, Dorothy and Warren Gillam, who I dedicated the book to, and who I wrote, they were my first teachers when I was growing up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So I just have a short overview of the book and of myself. And so I'll just begin with that. And so I was drawn to the study of race and Blackness and Black cultural politics in Brazil as an undergraduate student. I was intrigued that Brazil was a country with the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. And I was also intrigued by the way in which Brazil centered racial mixture in its national identity, where the country, would say that every Brazilian is marked with either with European, African, and indigenous heritage, that every Brazilian is racially mixed, and thus this racial mixture was thought to make racism less severe in Brazil, because the idea was that with the lack of a color line, there could not then be racial inequality and racism against a particular group. But I also knew that in Brazil, there were Black social movements. And so, there were activists who were vocally challenging these ideas of racial mixture and these national ideas of more cordial racism or less severe racism in Brazil. And I knew that, again, despite these national ideals, that academics and researchers were documenting how, racism appeared in Brazil and affected the daily lives of Afro-Brazilians, and manifested itself in access to economic resources, health, political representation, and access to education. And so I became interested in studying Black social movements in Brazil, and those who are really pushing for social change around the ways that Blackness and racial inequality were understood in the country. So just a little bit more context. So when I began studying in the early 2000s, Brazilian universities were implementing affirmative action, and these policies were meant to provide access to higher education for Afro-Brazilians, indigenous people, and poor Brazilians. They worked a little bit differently than they do in the United States, but the idea was to open up higher education for people who had been excluded. And then Law 10.639 was also passed in Brazil, which mandated the teaching of Black history and culture in primary schools. And so there were all of these debates at the time around in newspapers and in public venues about whether affirmative action was appropriate for Brazil, and whether, what constituted racism in order to, have these different policies in Brazil. So in the midst of all of these debates, this television network was founded called TV da Gente. And let's see, there it is. And so I just have in my presentation some stills from some of the media that I look at in the book, because this television network was founded with the idea and with the goal of representing Black people and racial diversity in Brazil. It was called Our TV, or TV da Gente. And it was the first television network of its kind in Brazil. And so in the book, I look at this network, but I also go beyond that, and I look at short films, videos, and other illustrations produced by Afro-Brazilians. So there's a variety of different media in the book, but I'm arguing that these media channel the demands made by the Black movement. And so if the Black movement was demanding for Black people to move into higher education, or for Black history to be taught in schools, Black media producers are demanding access to representation. They're demanding the ability to tell their stories, and they're demanding for, to represent Black people in ways that they determine. So the media that I'm looking at is produced by Afro-Brazilians and centers Afro-Brazilian protagonists. This runs contrary to mainstream media at the time, where on network television and in films, there tended to be predominantly white casts. And when Afro-Brazilians did appear, they tended to appear in very stereotypical roles, such as maids and service workers. So the media that I look at, it departs from this mainstream media, and in that it discusses racism. It presents Black children as protagonists in films, and Afro-Brazilians as hosts of the films. And this still is from one of the films I look at in the book. It's called Colors and Boots, or Cores e Botas, and it's by the director Juliana Vincenti, and it focuses on a Black girl and kind of the violence of this predominantly white media on the psyche of a Black girl. And so part of a question that the book is trying to answer is, what would media look like, that shows, how Black lives matter in Brazil? And so in the book, I argue that the media that I'm looking at foments anti-racism. And I'm arguing that anti-racism emerges in the demand to have access to the means of production, that it comes through in the demands to ascribe meanings to Blackness, for Black media producers to ascribe meanings to Blackness, meanings to their own identities in the films and in the stories that they're telling. And that they have a right to center Black protagonists in the stories and embed their experiences in the text. And finally, this anti-racism that I'm arguing is part of these programs comes through in that many of the programs depict racism and how it operates in Brazil. So many of the programs, like I said, they raise this issue of racism, and it shows the effects of racism on Black characters. So just to conclude, and this is a slide from one of the programs that I look at again in the book. It's called Is That Okay With You? And it was this kind of ironic, humorous take on representations of racism in Brazil. And this is the family that produced it. So just to wrap up, so we're at a point in time now when we're thinking about and interrogating racism, structural racism and its manifestations, certainly in the United States, but also in Brazil and other parts of the Americas. And so I'd like for the book to be a place to think about this demand for visual representation outside of the United States, and to think about the kind of programs that emerge from these demands, and how Black media producers participate in these anti-racism initiatives in Brazil. So with that, I will conclude, and I look forward to the discussion with Dr. Gates.
Thank you so much for that overview, which I think gives us a bit of a hint and a teaser of all of the kind of fantastic stuff that you're doing in this book that I'm really just thrilled to kind of dig into today. So thank you also as well for allowing me to be in conversation about your work. And the first thing that really struck me when I was kind of, just at least starting the book and reading the introduction is, I think there's this tendency, and this obviously is as well as I do, when people talk about Black media, it tends to kind of get stuck sometimes at the level of representation and just talking about images and characters and stereotypes. But you're doing some really kind of fascinating work here, especially at the level of method. So you do the textual analysis, right? But you also do these interviews with the media producers, and you say something in the intro that you did interviews, but you visited them on set, and you attended social events and family gatherings and media screenings. And I was really struck when you described meeting up with the family who were shooting the YouTube series, and you come to interview them, but they're almost film producing you, they have their love seat, right, and they have a chair waiting for you, and they're you sit here. And I just thought that was so fascinating. But could you, just to kind of kick it off, could you talk a little bit about just your methods and how you sort of landed on how you wanted to explore the questions and the best ways to explore the questions that you're taking up in the book, and also I guess what any difficulties in terms of interviewing these media producers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you so much for that question. This question of methods is really interesting to me too, because I'm an anthropologist studying media, and so I read a lot of media studies work, and so I'm always looking at media studies, and I'm looking at, okay, how are they doing this? But then I know that I have to go to the field, and the media that I'm looking at is all alternative, so I have to kind of first find it myself and then subject it to the analysis. So part of the kind of finding the media was that I kind of began with different networks, where I kind of began at the University of Sao Paulo, and I started asking people, and I began with this television network, which I talked about a little bit. It was called Our TV. And so I began with a television network, and I would just ask around, and I'd say, does anybody know anyone who works at this television network? And so someone did. They put me in contact with this person, and he's a journalist. His name was Osvaldo Faustino. And so he, agreed to meet with me, and then he would put me in contact with other people. So it was basically kind of like a snowball method. And then finally, I met one person who really kind of opened up her address book to me, and kind of gave me a list of everybody's information, who I was then able to contact people in that way. And then when I would contact them, I would tell them, oh, so-and-so gave me your information, and then they would meet with me. And I just say that because I think it can be really difficult when you're trying to find this media that is not necessarily readily available. So I did that. And then when I was interviewing people, I would try to first get the media itself and watch it, and try to determine the kind of themes and themes of the programming. Who were they having on? What were they doing? And then I would develop interview questions, kind of asking them why they made these decisions, why they made these, why they wanted to, what were they trying to show by, by exploring this particular theme. And then I was also interviewing them as well about their own background and their own training in producing media and their work in these different networks. So I ended up doing a lot of interviews and then transcribing the interviews. Yeah, and then like I said, I would also bring the the media into dialogue with the person who was making it, and then and then the participant observation I did whenever I could get on set. I would go to a place where the media was actually being viewed. I would show up, and I would be taking my notes and things like that. On these, in these different spaces. And the one area that's where I kind of begin the book is with the family, which is where I ended my presentation. And this family, they were in Rio de Janeiro, and they were filming this video series, and it was a humorous video series on racism. And I had gotten in contact with them, who a friend of a friend actually put me in contact. And then they agreed for me to interview them. And I thought I was just going to go and just sit down and do an interview like at their house, and then that would be it. But they themselves had planned. They knew I was coming, and so they told me to come to the film set where they were filming. I accompanied them to film the program, and then yes, they produced kind of the interview where it was like a set, and that's the thing. Like it was a set where they had a seat set up, and they had a camera, and they were filming me interviewing them. And this would actually happen quite a bit too. People would sort of respond to our interviews, and they would say, "Oh, if only people could record this. Like this in and of itself is something interesting to have a Black media producer being interviewed by like a researcher." So they kind of realized the novelty of these situations and wanted to like capture them on video. But the last thing I'll say too is that much of that I think is informed by the fact that, of course, they themselves are media producers. So they themselves, are actors and directors and journalists for mainstream media. Like many of them were producing this alternative media, but they had worked at TV Globo, which is like the NBC of Brazil. They'd worked in like mainstream film sets, and so they had this knowledge of how to do this, and so they were they had no problem kind of bringing that sense of of mediation to the process of me as a researcher. So they were kind of like pulling me in addition to me pursuing them. So yeah.
I mean, it's interesting though, because I mean, in addition to them being media producers, right? And like, obviously, I mean, I'm just kind of in my head, like, imagine like, look, we want this to look right? we want to make sure it looks good, and because we don't know what you're going to do with this after, right? But there's also this idea that comes across in your book, especially for the media producers who had worked at these like mainstream predominantly white spaces where they had been the only ones, that there's very much this sense that they are very not just invested in creating images, but very invested in the politics of representation. And with all of the interviews that you do, they all have such a clear understanding of sort of like correcting the problems of stereotyping and the misrepresentations of Afro-Brazilians. And it struck me that perhaps that's also part of like their investment in making sure the interview with you, is the way that it is, because it's part of this, kind of larger project. I had a follow-up question about your interviews before we move on to something else, which is, did you find it difficult to get people to trust you? Because I would imagine there would be a researcher's like, hey, I want to interview you about your humorous take on racism. And I would imagine there might be some skepticism or some suspicion. Did you encounter any issues sort of gaining people's trust?
Yeah, and so to your other point that you just said about the part of the larger project, like them invested in the cultural politics of the media. Absolutely. And that was kind of an irony that I noticed too, in that I am trying to represent people who dislike the way in which they have been represented by mainstream media. And so, yes, so that irony is definitely there. And so they are invested in multiple forms of representation, whether it be with me or with like mainstream media as well. And then that leads to this question of like, of trust and suspicion, because I'm a foreigner, and I might also, I'm engaged in this project of representation as well. And so, how might that bode for them? I think that part of the way I was able to, I think, gain people's trust was by making contacts through other people, because many times people, the first thing they would ask me was like, who do you know, like who sent you? And when I just said, oh, it was this other person, they'd instantly say, oh, okay, fine. So I think that part of my rapport came from the people, who I had initially had contact with. And so, I'm very grateful to them, because I think I was basically, I don't know, like using sort of their reputation in order to help me. And it wasn't clear to me at the time, but they would tell me sometimes, tell this person that I sent you, and then they'll talk to you, because they know each other. So there was that. And then I think with the particular questions I was asking, I would ask like, how do you view the mainstream media? And I wouldn't initially, of course, like shut people down. I think in Brazil, what can happen when people talk about racism is people will dismiss it. They'll say, oh, no, that wasn't racism. That was this, or, that didn't really happen. They didn't mean it, or, people will like diminish it. And so there's not a lot of spaces to always talk about these kinds of issues. So when I kind of like come knocking on their door and I'm like, I want to talk about, racism, it's kind of a novel moment. And the fact that I'm foreign, I think opens up that space to do that, because I'm not, I'm not someone who lives there necessarily, who's going to like, tell someone that they might know, or whatever have you. So I think that those are factors that were kind of working for me. And then I think also probably the fact that I myself am Black was helpful. And so people would also kind of refer to the United States, and they'd say, well, in Brazil, things are like this, unlike in the United States where things are like that. So people knew to a certain extent what was happening, at least with the media in the United States, and we could talk about that. At the time, the show Everybody Hates Chris was very popular in Brazil. And so we would talk about that. So I think that, so there are just various things. And then also, last thing I'll say is I also just kind of kept going back. So I kept going back, and I kept talking to people, and I kept recontacting people over and over again. And so I think that those were some of the things that helped to like build those relationships with people. And then I would also send them things that I would write and tell them what I was thinking as well. So I just try to be as transparent as I could.
No, I mean, I really like that idea as well, that like somebody had to vouch for you, which is, I often feel like that's how things work, especially with marginalized communities. You know what I mean? You can't just be a stranger showing up and getting access, right? That somebody has to sort of vouch, on your behalf. You mentioned something that I wanted to kind of touch on. You mentioned that a lot of times people would say, oh, that wasn't racist, or they would explain something away. And I know that in chapter 4 of the book, where you're talking about films featuring Black children and adolescents, that, it's sort of a thing that Afro-Brazilian parents don't necessarily, one of the claims you make in the book is that they don't necessarily talk about race and racism with their children, and that what these films are doing is they're really intervening there, right? And sort of providing like the language around that. It made me think a bit about Linda Williams, film scholar. She has this phrase I like called color muteness, as opposed to like color blind, like people are color mute, like it's there, but they can't talk about it, or they don't have the language to talk about it. So in a book that is all about Blackness in media that is all about sort of the intersection of racism in society and media representation. How were you able to phrase questions or to sort of find your way into those conversations, given what seems like this sort of like social, cultural, like reluctance to even acknowledge racism as a thing?
Mhm. Yeah, I think many of the people who I would talk to, they themselves had at that point developed a very pretty clear and strong like critique of the media and of racism in Brazil. And one question I would ask people kind of toward the beginning was like, do you identify as Black, and like why? And everybody did, and I think everybody did because of the way I was finding them. I was finding them through these Black media projects, so which kind of put them in a particular you know, circle. There's not that many Black journalists and media producers, so many people already knew each other. And so I would ask them that, and many of them would kind of recount these experiences when they were younger, and even many times like when they were in college, which is where they would have sort of come to consciousness about race and racial inequality in Brazil. And so they would say things like, well, my whole family's Black, and they've you know, and they've always talked about racism. Or some people would say, well, my mother's white and my father's Black, but people never would believe that I was my mother's child because, you know, the mother's white. And I always thought, I was always bothered by that. And so you're thinking, well, if this is like a mixed race nation where everybody thinks about being racially mixed, then why would you not assume that a Black child could, you know, be from a white mother? But, you know, these are the stories that people would tell. So they had these experiences, and many of them had, you know, gone to college, and then it was like in working in professional work as well, where they started to notice these differences, these problems with race and racial inequality. And many times they would start to like talk to each other, or like look at a book, or kind of see like what's going on, because you're right, there's not necessarily like a larger discourse that can explain, you know, these situations. There's no one to say, oh yes, this is very common because, you know, this is how racism operates. So you're just kind of there bewildered, like what's going on. And so that's when they would start to talk to other people, and, you know, even join other groups, and like I said, like look for more information. So by that point, they had, you know, already developed this very kind of pointed like racial critique that they were then kind of actualizing with their own work and media production.
No, it's really, as somebody who is sort of like terrified of ever talking to media producers, I'm kind of in awe of like the amount of work that you did in that regard. Were there any, so I also like that you mentioned that you watched the programs first, and then you went and sort of talked to the producers. Did your view or like your opinion on any of these films or television programs change, like from the time of first viewing, you know, and then after the process of having talked to the producers, and I guess also as well, you know, the kind of thing that I find can be really hard to capture when you do media studies is, you know, as a researcher, we kind of sit and we watch a thing, you know, we kind of have our reading of it. You can go and talk to like, you know, the creator, and they say, well, this is what I was trying to do. And you're like, okay, but then you go and see that with an audience, and they laugh at different places, you know, I mean, they react in the wrong ways. And that's a completely different experience then too, right? Which can very often suggest, I think, some different interpretations of kind of what a text means. So did you have any films or programs that you had one opinion of when you started this project that sort of shifted or evolved or changed over the course of the research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I was looking at the programming for TV da Gente, which was, or Our TV, which was the television network, I had basically I had watched some of the programming, and it was mainly like a show where there was like a host, and he would, have people on to like, interview them. And the way that people kind of described it was like, they would say it was like a David Letterman type of like night show. That's not necessarily what it was, but the point was that it had a host, and he had guests on, and he would interview those guests. And many of the guests were like other, Black figures, like religious figures, or, police officers, or, cooks, or a judge, people like that. And so I didn't notice anything particularly different about the programming. And so to me, it looked like a relatively normal show, in that it replicated, I think, other programming in Brazil, but they were like putting Black people in the in the roles.
Mhm.
When I went to talk to people about it, I would ask people, well, what was your goal with this television network and with this programming? How is it different from mainstream programming? And many times they would say there's no difference at all. And I was kind of like, and I would say like, no, but isn't there more of a difference? Because I'm thinking in my head, well, there is a difference, like everybody's Black, or, and then the content becomes a little bit different. But they kind of refused any notion of difference. And that kind of sent me into a panic sometimes when I would ask people that, because I expected a much longer response. Because I expected them to, because like you said, they are invested in this cultural politics. The reason why you would start a whole television network, to me, seems to be because you're going to produce something different. But they would say, oh, no, we're just doing the same. We're just doing like what's on Brazilian TV. And I would say, oh my gosh. And everyone would say this, like, no, very, very few people would say anything different. And then some people were kind of negative on the difference. They would say, yeah, there was no difference at all. And that's why I was annoyed with working there, because we could have done, something much different. So my point in saying all of that was that sort of changed for me, like how I was viewing that programming.
Mhm.
And what its purpose was, because I thought it was, well, I would still say it is like projecting kind of Black people in these different roles, but I realized that part of their goal was also to sort of join mainstream television. Like they weren't necessarily interested, at least in the television network, with like departing significantly from the conventions of mainstream television that had already been established by by network TV. And so that was something that completely shifted my thinking, in thinking about like, what's different and what the goals are for their, for this production.
Mm-hmm. It's I wanted to shift just a little bit because it's interesting to hear. I can't. If I were you, I'd be panicking. Like, what do you mean? There's no different? That's like the premise of the book. But it's in. I mean, but then also, I always think that how people understand their projects, or how they articulate their projects officially, isn't always exactly what the projects are too. And so it's interesting to hear these media producers say there's no difference, because one of the things that I found super fascinating is the way that you draw out these international connections, these like international Black connections. I mean, in chapter 1, you mention like these soul parties, and people having parties and showing scenes from Wattstax and Shaft, and sort of adopting kind of like Black American aesthetics, like afros and different clothing and things like that. And you trace those connections across like the diaspora to television networks as well. And one of the things I was hoping you could talk about it in a bit of detail here are these connections between like Brazilian television networks and BET. And you, in chapter 2, you say something that about our TV, was inspired by BET. But then you go on and you say, well, yeah, like they actually just called Robert Johnson, right? They called him, but he wasn't at BET anymore. Then they called Robert Townsend and they made a deal and he like gave him some programming. I thought that was such a fascinating example of the flows and connections across like global Black television that was very much like new to me. So could you talk a little bit about that and how you sort of found out about that as well?
Yeah, that is really fascinating to me as well. I think part of when I was initially doing the project too is I was interested in this relationship between African Americans and Afro-Brazilians, and I was interested in these flows and how they circulate between the two countries, and so yeah, when I was started with the Our TV doing the research, the newspaper articles about them, about the network, kind of said things like they had gotten money from Angola and to start the network, and that was kind of it. And so then I would start asking people around, and they would start like, you know, telling me more stories and, you know, showing me different information, where basically the founder of the network was a Black celebrity in Brazil, and his name was Nichinho, and he decided to start this Black television network, and I think he was trying to kind of grab hold of the energy of the moment, like I said, around like these debates about race, and so he already had these contacts in Angola with government officials there. And so the idea was that they would produce these programs in Brazil, and then they would send them back to Angola as well, where they could be viewed there. And then they got the idea from Black Entertainment Television, and this came about when I would just ask people, you know, why did you start the network? Where did you get the idea? And they would just say, oh, from your country, you know, we got the idea from Black Entertainment Television. And I thought, oh, okay. And I don't know that people had necessarily watched that much Black Entertainment Television, because when I say that, sometimes people in the United States are like, have this disdain, like they're like, oh, you know, we're like, where, you know, they're getting, you know, this from programming here. I think they really just got the idea for a network for Black people from the United States and decided to, you know, execute it in Brazil. So they weren't necessarily then looking at the programming and saying, we're going to replicate the programming. They really just wanted to replicate the idea. And so then, yeah, it was Nichinho, the founder, who, like I said, he's a celebrity and he has these contacts where having a discussion with the, you know, founder of BET was not very, very fruitful, because they wanted to actually have a partnership. But, you know, he found out that it was sold to Viacom, and that would not be viable. And then they traveled to the United States to visit the Black Family Channel, and so they ended up sending them, you know, programming from the Black Family Channel to like just circulate on Our TV. And so when I was there in the beginning, I would watch the Black Family Channel programs on Our TV with subtitles. And it didn't, I don't know how it was taken up, because it was kind of like, you know, it was like US programming being sent to Brazil. So I don't know that it was necessarily that, you know, culturally, you know, I don't know, conducive for Brazil. But it was there, I think, to fill time on the network. And then they had their local programming that they had made. And then, like I said, the plan was to send some programming to Angola, but I don't think that ever came to fruition as well. Because when I would talk to the people who were working at the network, they would say, well, we don't really know what people in Angola would want to watch, right? So we see these flows between all these different places, but then there are also these, like, you know, all these disjunctures too, where they you know, things come in, but they don't always make sense. They don't always, like, you don't always know what the other, you know, people want, but there's this like assumption that, well, we're all Black, so we can, you know, we can help each other with these resources, but, you know, there can be limits to it too.
Are there other American, Black or otherwise, American shows that are that circulate in Brazil?
Oh yeah, yeah. So when I was there, like I said, Everybody Hates Chris was incredibly popular. It would be dubbed into Portuguese, and then there was also, it would be shown with subtitles. It was on like multiple channels, and so it was very popular. There was even a short documentary filmed about people who liked the programming, and many times people in that documentary said they were like, well, we like Everybody Hates Chris because you see so few Black people in television in Brazil, that this program is kind of a representation that we all really are attracted to. They liked how the program would talk about racism. So because when Chris was a child, there would be these different scenes where he would have these like racial altercations, and it was also kind of humorous, and people that for Brazilian television, that would have been like something different and probably refreshing, because that you saw that very, very little. And then they also had a campaign to get, is it Tisha Campbell? No, not Tisha Campbell. The mother.
Tina Arnold?
Yeah, Tashina Arnold, yes, to get her to come to Brazil to be in the carnival and to be like the queen of a carnival float. And I think she thought it was like a joke, like what are you talking about? But they sent her like a video and an invitation, and they were like, come down, we love you, we love Everybody Hates Chris, you should be in the carnival. And she went down, and she was, I think she was in a float, because it was,
oh wow,
it was in this documentary. Yeah, so that's one program that was very popular in Brazil at the time. I think there are others that float around, like films and things like that, but that was one where a lot of people watched it, and there was a lot of discussion about that program.
That's really fast. So I need to go like look that up, because that's a great story. I mean, you even talked about how there's a judge program which was like inspired by Judge Hatchett in the US, which I got to that part of the book, and I just thought I didn't see that one coming. Like on my bingo card, the Judge Hatchett, my grandmother loved Judge Hatchett, by the way, that was like her show. But I didn't expect that to be, Judge Hatchett, which is already, a Black kind of version, as you point out, like sort of following in the lines of like the People's Court and Judge Judy, but like a Black woman sort of adjudicating, and how that inspires a program in Brazil. But kind of going back to what you said before, you talk about this in the book, that it kind of works, but it can't kind of work, because the Brazilian, I mean, I'll let you talk about this more, but that the Brazilian legal system doesn't you would never have a jury for a civil case. Am I getting that right? And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that show as well, and just thinking about the ways that you have this US show that inspires something, but something isn't translating, right? Because of the very real like national differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all of these kind of these flows, but then they're like these fits and starts, and they get rerouted into these other directions. So yeah, they wanted to make a like you said, like a People's Court type of show, and the man who was supposed to be the judge is himself an actual judge, or he's a lawyer, and he is kind of a civil rights lawyer in Brazil, and he's very well known. He's a very loud voice for Black rights and against racism in Brazil. He was actually running for political office when I was there at one point, so he's very well known. His name's Dr. Egio Silva, and so he was supposed to be the judge, but like I said, he himself is a lawyer, so he knew the law, and he said you can't have a judge show like you see in the United States, because you can't read the jury, you can't read the sentence on television, you can't televise any of that. So he was the one who had to tell the people in the network, listen, we can't do all of this that you want to do that you see in the US, we can't do it. So that's when they moved the show to a like a Letterman type show, where he was then the host of the show, and he would invite people to come on, and then he would interview them, you know, about their different initiatives. So for example, he had on a minister in an Afro-Brazilian religion, which is called Candomblé. And so he interviewed this minister, and he had this organization that was focused on health and and Black health, and they would do these educational initiatives for you know, the Black community. And so he would, you know, just interview him there on the show about this, you know, about this initiative. So that's what the program began as like a kind of a judge show. And then it morphed into this other show. And then I would say too, in the book, I also talk about how they went to an actual court building, and they filmed kind of from the outside, like these court proceedings. And they showed the actual judge of the proceedings, because he was Black. And so they show him there in the frame. And he's like adjudicating this case between a worker who was not paid, and he was fired, and the owner of the restaurant. And so I think the owner of the restaurant ends up having to pay the employee, you know, as a result of this case. And so at the network, they interview the restaurant owner, they interview the employee, and they show, like I said, the judge who was a Black judge. And so they're trying to communicate this idea that to the audience, that you too can go to these court buildings, you can you know, fight for your rights, you can bring a case as well, and you can get a result that can hopefully work for you, if, you know, in the case of lost wages. So they're trying to do this kind of civic education for the audience, but also show this like Black judge, to show, like, you know, Black people in these roles of authority. So yeah, so that's how, so like I said, they wanted to do like a people's court, but they ended up having to shift it to like, you know, showing it in these other kinds of ways.
I mean, for me, that was the really fascinating part about your discussion around this court show, is that because it can't be like the People's Court or Judge Hatchett or whatever, it turns into this other thing, which is essentially like showing people how to advocate for themselves and making people aware of, you know, what their personal rights are, like, you know, this kind of educational process. What are your rights within the Brazilian system, right? And as you said, like, and you too can kind of advocate for yourself. It ties in, I thought, quite nicely with some of the things that you say in chapter 1, talking about civic and political organizations advocating for Black civil rights, and sort of amid this climate of Black protest, but that media and cultural production are really central there, which I thought was really, really interesting. I mean, you know, in the US, we get some initiatives and some pushes in the 1960s in the film industry to have, you know, more Black people, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera. And, you know, there's kind of an emphasis on studios to, you know, diversify their crew and things like that. You know, but then like largely not a whole lot of stuff. I mean, we've seen more stuff in the US, I think in 2020, kind of post George Floyd, with a lot of media companies thinking about, you know, also with the rise of like kind of corporate social responsibility and diversity initiatives. But you're talking about like policy, and you talk about media accountability movements and media activism in the early 2000s in Brazil, and policy proposals. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in that chapter, I was trying to link this kind of trajectory of Black movements and Black protests, and show how, you know, media has accompanied many of these steps along the way. And I was trying to show that because I was arguing that the Black movement and Black protest is sort of like foundational to much of this media. Like they're creating the conditions in which people then take them up and take them to other places like the media. And I think that is what, like, you know, gives this media its kind of anti-racist slant, if you will, or this anti-racist agenda that that I'm arguing it produces. So I'm trying to kind of argue, like, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from the fact that the Black movement is kind of creating the conditions for people to take up and then channel through the media. And so, yeah, and so people are, these movements like aren't, they're not just contained to the street. Like, people are taking them up, and they're saying, like, there was a politician who was like pushing for a law that was similar to kind of to affirmative action. So affirmative action kind of holds a set of spaces for like Black and Indigenous students. And so he was arguing that there should be a law that required a certain percentage of Black people to appear in the, in a program, like in a commercial or in the cast of a program. And so he, wrote up this law, and then he had a like a hearing around the law. And so he invited, I think around like 15 experts to talk about race and media production in Brazil. And so he invited like professors and actors, people who worked in media, and they all gave these testimonies about the kind of the problems around race and Blackness in the media. And in that part of the book, I'm kind of reading the transcripts from that hearing. And so you see people giving these testimonies about, for example, like the problem of Black actors and how, or with Black media producers, and they're saying numbers like there are so few Black media producers. They might say, I was the only Black media producer in my journalism class. I was one of like 10 Black people who then worked at this television network. And then people are talking about the actual images. And then other people are saying they're working in the media industry, and they're saying like, well, Black actors are at a disadvantage because they don't have as many roles. They don't have as much opportunity to then practice their craft. And then they don't get the kind of resources for training that like other, white actors get. And so, and they're trying to kind of denaturalize these ideas that, and these ideas were very prevalent, like, oh, well, we can't have Black actors because, they're not as good, right? They're not as, we don't have these quality Black actors. And so in these hearings, people are giving this testimony saying, well, this is what's going on. There's actually like a social context of inequality here about how resources are getting distributed and who's getting the training. It's not this natural idea of just Black inferiority. It's actual like conditions of who gets to have this time to practice and who gets this training. So that's one of the things that he was doing, was pushing for this policy. And then there are other like protests and these manifestos from people who are like, there was one, the Recife manifesto, where these actors were protesting at a film festival, and they're drawing up these manifestos, and they're saying like films should be directed by Black directors. Black people should not appear in stereotypical roles. Black people should not be heroes or villains, or they have all of these these like demands of what they think should appear in the media. So and I think the Black movement itself, like they would also kind of protest the media, and like you said, they would also sue the television networks for their representations as well. And so they would have a full lawsuit against, usually it was Globo, which is like the NBC of Brazil, I said. And so they would have a full lawsuit, and they would win.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's amazing. I know that are we going to the Q&A now, or I thought we were doing that at 7 in like a few minutes? Do I have time for one more question, or?
Yeah, absolutely, one more.
Okay.
I also have a question.
Oh.
But
Yeah, let me ask one last question. I mean, I have more, but I'll save them, for another time or for later. So we were just talking about policy, but then you also talk about in chapter 3, the really powerful use of humor and irony as a critique of racism and racist representation in Brazil. And I was really struck by, I've been trying to not have to say anything in Portuguese, like to the best of my ability, so I won't butcher it. But this figure, is it Sachi?
Oh, Sassy.
Sassy, thank you. This sort of like this folkloric character represented as a Afro-Brazilian sort of man on the street. And what I love about your discussion there is you say, and this is a quote in the book, the image of Sassy immediately calls on national sentiment and references the central place of Afro-Brazilian culture within it. Vaz's images implicitly ask how the Black figure can be central to Brazilian national folklore while Afro-Brazilian people confront police violence and aspects of racial inequality. And I really love that chapter because you really kind of gesture towards irony as this way of making a critique of like nationalism and sentimentality in a way that, you know, I would argue you kind of can't make in a straightforward way. Like you kind of have to come at it askew a little bit. And so I was hoping, just, you know, right before we turn it over to the questions from the audience, if you could say a little bit about sort of how you saw irony functioning in these really strong social critiques.
Yeah, thank you. That's that's probably my favorite chapter. And I love that the idea of the irony and the contradictions in that chapter. I thought people were really creative and inventive in the ways that they were like fomenting these critiques of Brazilian nationalism. And I never could have seen the irony coming. And I'm not that creative a person, so I could have never imagined this myself. And so one thing I saw was that sometimes people were like acting out racism, just like acting out these scenes of racism, and part of it, and kind of in a very like straightforward way, and this was funny, right? And so, and I got the joke, but I kind of didn't realize the particularity of it. And one of the ways I realized it was when I showed kind of my students some of the images, and they would say, "This is just racism." And I would say, "Oh, you like they don't get the context," right? So then I was like, "Oh, okay, there's something going on here," where I realized that, you know, to make it explicit, I realized that like in a context where racism is denied, to just enact racism is to make fun of this ideology that downplays the idea of racism. So they're kind of saying, like, if racism doesn't exist, then why is this racist thing happening to me on a regular basis? So they're making fun of the people who would say, like, well, we don't have racism in Brazil. And so they turn the camera kind of back on those people and make fun of them. And then with the Sassy, Sassy is a figure of like national folklore in Brazil, and he's this kind of beloved figure where he like stands on one leg and he has a hat and smokes a pipe, and he would be very, very common, and he's like very mischievous. He'll like, the idea is he'll steal things, so if something is missing, people might say, "Oh, Sassy took it." And Sassy's also generally represented as Black. And so this graffiti series kind of takes Sassy's Blackness and turns it from this like just this little mischievous thing to like the criminality that Black people experience, you know, projected onto them in everyday life. And so the graffiti artist Thiago Vaz kind of shows Sassy in these scenes of like racial, where he's being like stopped by the police, and in that, and I have an image of that in the book, where, you know, and I'm arguing that, you know, Sassy's Blackness turns from this marker of like mischief to, you know, actual criminality. And so it's making fun of this, you know, Brazilian idea of that kind of sometimes will center Black culture and will say, oh, like we have, you know, samba music, and, you know, they'll make Black culture sometimes central to the nation, but in a way that, again, like downplays the kind of like police violence. And so this graffiti, and by, you know, putting Sassy under arrest, kind of puts pressure on all these national ideologies.
Got it. I could ask you a million more questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Mabel and to the Q&A.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Racquel. Thank you, Reighan. That really great conversation. And please, we've been saying if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I thought I would start. I just want to say, thank you for bringing up that question of the ways in which, different representations are coming, as you said, from the United States, which I would love to know more because I think it will tie to the book that you're working on now. But also I'm glad because one of the questions I wrote down was like, what about other Portuguese speaking countries, particularly like Angola, Mozambique, that might be producing, especially now, various kinds of media, or even Nollywood for that matter, and maybe the impact, especially because Nollywood circulates worldwide, particularly within the Black diaspora, the impact of those representations on Brazilian TV or not. But also within the representations that are generative, maybe that's one question. The other question is, what about gender, sexuality, and also, does this become also maybe a platform for interlacing, questions of Blackness, right? With the ways in which women's bodies, queer subjectivities are also under threat, and those things also entwine, obviously, because of the ways in which violence is enacted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. I think with the, I didn't see much influence from programming coming necessarily from Angola or like African countries like Mozambique. The idea was to kind of send the programming there, but there are these histories of sending programming to Angola, and Angola kind of refusing Brazilian programming because, and this has happened in the past, like with Brazilian telenovelas, like these are like mainstream programming where they'll try to send them to Angola, and Angola in the past has said, we don't want this programming because none of these people look like us, and like all of these people are white, or they'll talk about like the stereotypes about Black people in Brazilian programming. So kind of historically, some of the critiques of Brazilian media have come from like these other African countries and their kind of idea that they'll just receive this media with no, with nothing to say. But the question of gender, yeah, that was that.
Can I just ask you maybe another question just about, has Nollywood had any impact? Because there is that in the late 19th, there's a huge migration actually of enslaved peoples from, the regions of what we now call Nigeria back actually to Nigeria. And I'm wondering if there would be any sort of connections with that also.
Yeah, so Nollywood, I think, is becoming more popular in Brazil, and I knew someone who was doing research on the reception of Nollywood films, particularly in the north of the country in Salvador. But I wouldn't be surprised if people also watch them in like in the south. So people were watching these Nollywood films, but I'm not sure necessarily what the fully what the reactions were to it, but at least in Salvador, like in the north, people would have that kind of knowledge of or some knowledge of Nigeria because of religion and because of like flows of candomblé. Like people know that West Africa is also a place of these particular religious practices, and so they have that knowledge. And I would think that watching like Nollywood would also help to like engage with this knowledge that people already have about West Africa in the north. But the gender, yeah, that was really important in chapter 4 when I talk about children and Black children and representations, particularly of Black girls. And so I've noticed in a lot of other films, not even other films beyond the book, but Black girls are constantly made a protagonist in these films. And I think that part of it is that, I think Black girls are sort of positioned as like the sort of the marginalized of the marginalized, because they're not only Black, and they're not only, they're not only children, but they're, Black girl children, and they tend to be seen as just like a natural, that they'll naturally follow in the steps of Black women, which will be to be a maid. And so they're seen as just this natural, like, flow into these service jobs. And so I think that, Black girls were then centered as protagonists in a lot of films, and they were made the protagonist and many times the hero. And the idea was that they needed to come to consciousness about race and racial dynamics that they were experiencing predominantly around their hair. And so the hair was like the site of racial awakening. And so usually they would, they had like natural hair, and usually like very either curly hair or coarse hair. And they would, the films would show the effects of seeing predominantly white media on these Black girls, where they would want to like straighten their hair and dye their hair blonde to match the images that they were seeing constantly on television. But then they'd have this like awakening where they would begin to see themselves differently, and they would reevaluate their appearance, and they would come to have like a positive evaluation of themselves in these films. And so I think these films are about like, children are kind of like hope for the future, and the youth are like the promise of the future. And I think they were showing a hope for like a racially conscious future in which girls and women will like be aware of these racial dynamics, and they'll be better able to confront them moving forward.
So again, if there are questions out there in our audience, please leave them in the Q&A feature. Racquel, I know you had some additional questions. I also do have some other questions.
Oh yeah.
I know Racquel had some as well.
Oh, I got a whole list, but I won't. So one of the things we didn't get to is I was kind of like looking forward. I mean, I'm really struck by when you're talking about a video series, and I also really appreciate that you're working on television. I mean, they're like, I always joke that like film is easy to work on and TV is hard because TV doesn't get saved. TV disappears. It's just, there are certain shows that I remember existing, but I cannot get them anywhere for all kinds of complicated reasons. And so I was thinking a little bit about like just the ephemerality of media, and that part of what's really important about your project is that you are, you're archiving them, sort of like within your book, and you're documenting their existence. I mean, I think especially for like a show that's a video series that I can get on YouTube now, but there's no guarantee I'll be able to get that next year, or even, what's the classic example of the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and they just recorded over all those VHS tapes. So like there are no originals, like that's it, the show's gone, But I was thinking specifically also about changes in media distribution and the rise of like streaming services, the rise of kind of like, web-based television programs. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit to how that is currently, or how you imagine that may impact Afro-Brazilian creators and Afro-Brazilian representation in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. No, I definitely think about like archiving and like documenting the projects and the people and what they're doing, because a lot of times many times when you read like histories of like Black Brazilians in say the 1910s and the 1920s, the sources tend to be from these like newsletters and newspapers that was called the Black Press. And so I would, read these history books, and that was one of the few places you could go to find out like what Black people themselves were thinking about like what was going on. And so I saw that Black media was like really important, particularly for historians, but I knew that, the entire record probably does not exist. You have to go around and piece it together. And I thought about like, well, what about the media that's being produced now? Like what the media is not only valuable as a historical document, I think it's valuable for what it tells us in the present. And so that was one of the things I was really interested in too, in not just what it tells us about the present too, but then also thinking about like you said, kind of documenting it and preserving what was going on. Because you can then find sometimes the media text, but then you don't have the people, who produced it as well. So, there's all of these things that can go missing. And then, and then the web-based, I think that web-based media and distribution is really, I think it's really a boon for Black producers, in that I think YouTube has sort of changed the game in a way, and like Vimeo, because people will just now make their own films and they'll put them on Vimeo, and that's, and that's what they're doing. Or they'll put them on, like I said, YouTube, and they'll just have their own YouTube channel. And so there are all of these YouTube now channels that a lot of Black Brazilians have, where it'll be this person's channel, and there will be all of these videos of just this person like talking about whatever it is they want to talk about on their, on their channel. And so you can find this quite a bit, and they get a lot of hits too. So they're becoming very popular actually, and very well watched. And so I think that this is people saying, well, if you're not going to put us on mainstream TV, then we're just going to make our own programming. And this is, and this is what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting. And they're not yet kind of being taken up by network TV, like how in the US we see people like Issa Rae going from her own series to network TV. I'm not seeing that happening yet, but the people who are taking them up is Netflix. And this is what you said too, in the web-based programming. So Netflix has become much more popular in Brazil now. And so they are, and they're kind of gaining a pretty large audience share. And I think they're taking away from mainstream network television as well. And so now Netflix is producing a lot of programming in Portuguese. They're using like Brazilian, production houses and programming, and they're putting it on Netflix. And I see more like racial diversity in this programming, which is why I'm bringing that up, because Netflix comes in with more of like a US idea of, well, these programs should be diverse like the population. And this happens with a lot of US companies. They'll go to Brazil and they'll say, well, 50% of your country is Black, so shouldn't that be reflected in the workers? And in many Brazilian companies, it's not reflected in that way. So like US companies kind of become sometimes this way for Black like creators to kind of get, a leg up, I guess. And so, so Netflix is actually becoming an outlet for a lot of different programming that is more diverse than the network TV. And now I think the network TV is trying to catch up in a way, or I don't know what you would call it, but I think they see that threat, and now they're beginning to change their programming with like network TV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's really fascinating, because these new streaming companies, especially like Netflix, even, YouTube already, which is Google, are able to connect in ways, globally, that I think complicates these old structures of corporate and sometimes national production, especially of television. We do have a question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for this talk. They start, in thinking about Brazil as a miscegenated, triracial state, there seems also to be a sort of longing and nostalgia for connection to Portugal in mainstream Brazilian media. Have references, connections to the colonial metropole appeared in your research? What characterizes the discourse around the Lusophone connection in the programs and networks you've worked on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I haven't seen that much with the people that I'm working with, that much about Portugal in particular. I think that their connections come more to, like, if they think about a connection, they think about like Angola or Mozambique, I guess, or Cape Verde, as well. And that's partially because there are actually also a lot of like Angolans in Brazil who kind of come back and forth. And the Angolan government has also, I've been talking to people who have been going from Brazil to Angola to work. So there's actually a lot of connection between those two countries. So when I think about those like transnational connections, it's mainly in Africa that they come up, but in Portugal, I don't really see those connections and people referring as much to Portugal. But I will say too, Portugal does have like a large African population there as well, like a large Lusophone African population there, and Brazilians actually in Portugal too. So I wouldn't be surprised if it became more of a more of an entity. And now I did this research probably at this point like 15 years ago, because I think you're right, like I am seeing more Brazilians now going to Portugal as well and moving there and going to live there. So I think that Portugal is not that it never was a part of the Brazilian idea, because obviously it was the original, like the colony, right? But now I see it becoming more salient as people are going there and traveling there more to visit.
Great. And I just maybe want to ask, because we have a little bit of time left, a few minutes. Can you tell us more about the new project, provisionally, I think, titled Diasporic Agency? And what that's about, how it evolves the research, and what what are you looking at currently?
Yeah, thank you. So my new project is called Diasporic Agency, and I'm looking at the relationship between Afro-Brazilians and African Americans, meaning African Americans meaning like Black people from the United States. And I know that that's a broad category, but basically I'm looking at how Black Brazilians kind of pull from African American cultural production and they enact it in Brazil. And I'm arguing that this kind of calls into question these ideas of Brazilian racial exceptionalism. So what does that mean? So Brazilian racial exceptionalism is this idea that Brazil is exceptional, right? That Brazil has racism, but it's different from the United States and it's different from these other like multiracial countries. And that usually means, again, that Brazil has like less harsh forms of racism. So that's this idea that like Brazil is exceptional. And so when Black Brazilians kind of pull from this cultural production, some of the cultural production they're pulling from are like, scenes from like Black Power, scenes from like the civil rights movement. And so, for example, I look at this one play that these Black celebrities put on in Brazil, and the play was about Martin Luther King, and it's called The Mountaintop. And it was written by like a Black woman, from the United States. And the play is about Martin Luther King, and it's about like his last days when he was like his last days living. And it's basically King kind of talking about the civil rights movement and what his goals were and things like that. And so my point in that is that you have these Black Brazilian actors who are putting on this play about the civil rights movement and in the United States. And when they talk about the play, they'll say things like, well, we need Martin Luther King here in Brazil because we have racism here. And my project is kind of saying, well, what does that mean that you need Martin Luther King in Brazil? Like, what does Martin Luther King do for racism in Brazil? And I'm arguing that they're making this case that Brazil is not exceptional, that Brazil can be subject to the same kinds of racism that we see in the United States, and that in pulling from these different influences, that they're making this case that Brazil can use the same kinds of the same kinds of protests and the same kinds of things that we see elsewhere, those can apply to Brazil as well. So that's what my argument is, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at all of these different scenes and scenarios of Black Brazilians kind of using things from African Americans to make this case that Brazil is actually not that different. That, you know, so that's the next project.
Great, thank you. And we are looking forward to that. But I would say, in the meantime, please definitely check the chat for our discount from the University of Illinois Press for this really great book, Visualizing Blackness, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media. And so I want to thank Reighan for sharing insights from the book, and Racquel for an excellent conversation. I think that touched on many important points in the book. I also want to just give a special thanks to our dedicated colleagues, Sean Mendoza, also to Sharon Harris, who keeps this whole enterprise working, James Jenning, who are all essential to bringing you tonight's event. But also I want to give a special thanks to our ASL interpreters, Jennifer Blake and Lisa Weems, for being here today. And just a little of what's coming up as we round out this semester and academic year. Thursday, this is not on our main poster, but we're exciting that this came together. We have a book talk that features Dr. Elizabeth Alexander discussing her new book, The Trayvon Generation, with our colleague, Dr. Farah Griffin. And so I think that would be exciting. And on Thursday, April 21st, we will host our last in the conversation series with Dr. Kevin Quashie and his book, Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being. And Kevin will be in conversation with our colleagues, Dr. Robert Gooding-Williams and Dr. Saidia Hartman. So for registration and information on these events and other upcoming programs, please see our website that was dropped in the chat, which is afamstudies.columbia.edu. So thank you all for coming, and take good care, all. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reighan.
Thank you.